Welcome to Carnegie's Majority Minority discussion about immigration, demographic change, and what it's doing to democracies all around the world. I am thrilled to be here with Justin and Natalia. So as we put in our teaser about the event, people claim that immigration and these massive flows that are coming through and demographic change have been helping a wave of populist parties, and they cite Sweden and Italy and the United States. But immigration and demographic change don't affect politics directly. Politicians who tell a powerful story about these forces do, as well as other persuasion shaping entities. And we see this here at home. LA last week was embroiled in this nasty battle about Latino city councilors and racist remarks. It has to do with how these things are framed and shaped, and the role that politicians, leaders, media personalities play in interpreting our social world is a really important insight, and it's an insight not of mine, but of Justin's particularly, because it means that our feelings toward immigration and other ethnic groups aren't just biologically determinative. There's a lot of sense when you read the literature on this area that, oh, we like our in-groups, we don't like our out-groups, therefore there's going to be these problems. But while we do have an innate sense of in-group and out-group, what that means, what we do with it, who is in which group, all of that is more malleable than a lot of the psychological literature has been making out. So we're going to discuss how these demographic, social, political realities are shaping our countries, what they're doing on immigration. Not my set of topics. Those of you who know me know. These are our guest set of topics. So I'm really thrilled that Justin is here. Justin Gest is an associate professor of policy and government at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. He studies just about everything in this space. Actually, when I was looking over his books, he's authored 6 books. His most recent is the one we'll talk about, Majority Minority, on places that have already made that transition. But he's got books on the white working class, books on different immigration regimes and how different states, countries have dealt with different immigration regimes, on Muslim integration into the West. He's written a textbook. So we'll talk about a number of the other books as well. And he co-edits the Oxford Study in Migration and Citizenship, and previously founded the London School of Economics Migration Studies Unit. And he's a prolific writer in popular journals as well. So if you don't feel like reading academic texts, you can usually pick up an op-ed page. Natalia is the Associate Director of the Migration Policy Institute's International Program. She is a regular advisor of governments on what to do, as well as multinational banks, development institutes, what to do. How do you combat xenophobia? What are smart strategies around migration? How do you manage the migration itself? How do you manage the talking about it and the narrative and so on? She attended Hungary's Central European University, which those of us who know some of the politics of migration and so on has been a little bit in the news over the years. It was one of the early victims of the growing nationalism of Viktor Orban. And so she's experienced some of the downsides of these issues herself. And she's also someone who manages volunteers in her spare time to integrate new immigrants in the DC area. So she's going to touch the issue from the highest levels of policy all the way to the kind of human level of the one-to-one interaction. And I want to just jump into the central premise of our discussion that I laid out at the beginning. And Justin, I'll go to you first, because this was really your insight that I thought was just put a pin in so much that was important. A lot of people seem to suggest that immigration or birth rates or demographic change are these independent forces, and they just look at the numbers and say, oh, these numbers don't actually seem to correlate directly to natural reactions in body politics. So I'd like you to comment on that, and then Natalia, I'm going to turn to you for your thoughts about how these shifts in immigration and in demographics more generally affect the democratic political realm.
Yeah, this is a big question, Rachel, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you guys. It's great to be with you and Natalia at Carnegie. This is really the big question of the book. How do societies respond to demographic change, to great demographic change, transformative demographic change? And, up until now, most of the folks who have conducted research on these reactions have been psychologists or people using psychological methods. So they basically intervene in someone's life and say, hey, by the way, your society is changing all around you, or this outgroup is moving into your neighborhood, or look at these national demographic statistics. What do you think? And then they check their responses across a variety of different outcome variables. And what we've seen is that people are instinctively quite defensive. They protect their in-group position. They're less likely to want to redistribute resources. They're more exclusionary in their political and social attitudes. The reactions are not great if you're trying to cultivate a sense of coexistence. But these interventions are also taking place over sometimes, 30 minutes or 30 seconds, I should say, and evaluated over the course of a very short survey. In some cases, they go up to 10 days in their analysis. But we know that demographic change is something that takes place over decades, in some cases up to a century. And so if we really want to understand how societies respond to demographic change, it's really a question of how leaders and institutions channel these instinctively divisive, instinctively defensive reactions into a way of forging together a new understanding of the nation, a sense of coexistence. And that's really what my work tries to understand, is what are the crucial pivot points where both states try to control demographic change on the one hand, but also where they pivot their understanding of the state, of the nation, towards inclusion on the one hand or exclusion.
And Natalia, you study a lot about narratives here. And can you talk a little bit about what policies shape the ability for a narrative to move toward inclusion or exclusion, and a policy to move toward inclusion or exclusion? What political realities and what types of government policies?
Sure. I think what's interesting here also is the perception of change versus the reality of change. And I think, societies are grappling with what they're seeing on the ground, but also with how this change is being communicated to them and by whom. And so I think there is a really interesting confluence of factors in terms of how do people decide what information is credible? How do they decide what to believe? And when you throw this together with immigration, you get this very volatile cocktail because, of course, anxiety about immigration is as old as time. Scapegoating immigrants is as old as time. And the themes that we see being used are remarkably consistent. You see the same concerns sort of colliding with immigration all the time, economic security, physical security, crime. We saw public health and disease come in with COVID again, kind of rearing its head. And this idea of, people's sense of their place in the world and their children's place in the world and their opportunities in front of them. And so you have all these really fundamental fears that people are trying to figure out. You have this information landscape that is bombarding people with different pieces of information, and they have to make sense of it. And I think, this is what we're all trying to understand. How do narratives get introduced, both positive and negative? And what makes certain narratives sort of take off and other ones kind of go dormant? And we see that, in my opinion, ebb and flow so dramatically sometimes. So we can't get complacent that we know how people feel about immigration or about anything that's happening in their lives. I think people hold all sorts of different views about the same phenomenon at once. And what's happening with politics right now is that certain strands of that are getting teased out and accentuated. And I think if we want to understand the impact on politics, we need to understand how that's happening. How do certain strands get inflamed? And what can you do to counter that?
It's a really interesting and important point about the complexity of our actual belief systems versus the thinness of the lines that get pulled in the public discourse sometimes. Let's put a parenthesis around the narrative because I want to come back to it. But Justin, I want to talk about your book because one of the narratives that's become salient in the United States, but also in a handful of other countries, is this notion of majority-minority society. And this was actually a census person, is my understanding, who first came up with this data and sort of did a straight linear projection and said, oh, guess what? The whites are going to be the minority eventually, and here's a year to put on it. And then Democrats cheered and said, oh, well, now we'll be a winning party because these people will clearly all vote for us, and Republicans blanched. And suddenly we started to get a whole lot of very linear thinking based on this set of circumstances. You look at a number of states that became, I don't want to say states, you look at a number of places because some of them are cities, some of them, they have all different realities that underwent this transition. And you looked at how they shaped these narratives that Natalia is just talking about and how they shaped their policies to shape their narratives. So can you just summarize a long book in a couple of minutes here to share some of the decision points that governments go through?
Yeah, this is the crux of the research. So most people think that what the United States is approaching, this majority minority milestone, where we will cease to have a single ethnic or racial majority group, is unique in the world. It's not unique. It's just rare. It hasn't happened very much, particularly from immigrant origin populations. So I study 5 different sovereign countries and 1 U.S. state that had sovereign control over immigration at the time. Singapore, Bahrain, Mauritius, Trinidad and Tobago, the Hawaiian Kingdom before it was annexed by the United States, and also the state of New York. And all of these places encountered a majority minority milestone one way or another, in often very different ways. And what we learn is that the 2 most critical junctures that they face is the question of whether they grant and actually execute, fulfill the minority group that enters, or groups that enter, equality and enfranchisement or not. That is a crucial early decision about whether you grant equal status to diverse groups. Once that decision is made, a follow-on decision is made, usually slightly later in those countries' history. And in many ways, this is, I think, where we find ourselves now in the United States as a country that did grant formal equality to all of its minority groups over time. And the second question becomes, how do we construct the national identity? How do we respond to the nativism that emerges, by the way, across all these societies to define who we are? And that question really depends on whether a state pivots towards coexistence and towards inclusion of those diverse groups, or whether it pivots towards their exclusion and an exclusive understanding of who we are, one that is more ethnocentric or religiously centric than others. So those are the 2 crucial decisions. Now, how they decide to pivot that identity one way or another, it comes across a variety of different pivot points that I identify across the different places I study. The first relates to how the national self-understanding is ideologically, and whether that's an inclusive one or an exclusive one. And so it's really about the question of how the state answers who we are. The second relates to spaces that are related to commerce. So commerce can be a very interdependent experience where we have a diverse labor market and are able to access goods and services from diverse people. But it can also produce racialization of poverty, the segmentation of the labor force. So it can be an exclusive experience too. The third relates to culture. So it can relate to the arts, cuisine, film, sports. These are all places of hybridity and of fusion of people working together across boundaries to produce something or to pursue a shared goal, a competitive goal sometimes. But they're also the sites of a lot of cultural disputes. The fourth possibility, the fourth pivot relates to education and the socialization of youth. Are schools producing inclusive curricula that acknowledge the contributions of a variety of different people to a nation's history? Are they integrated schools? Do you have a national universal set of conscription into national service or military service? Those states that don't, that are segregated or that have very narrow curricula, can be a very exclusive identity-making experience. And then finally, the fifth pivot relates to the politics of threat. Do people and do elites identify the threat to the country, to the nation, as being external and therefore unifying internally, or as internal, where they actually see that the greatest threat to the country is coming from fellow countrymen, from fellow citizens? And that, of course, can be very divisive. And we are seeing countervailing trends across all of these pivots that relate to the national ideology, culture, commerce, education, the socialization of youth, and threat. We see countervailing trends across each of these 5 pivots in the United States today. Where we go will really depend on where the weight of our energy lies. Is it in the inclusive pivots or towards exclusion?
Yeah, it struck me when reading your book that these were small states necessarily that you were looking at before. Then when you expand it to a country this large and this federalized, suddenly you can have many different policies that are simultaneously existing, and also that it's not necessarily a linear path. The state can make a decision, and then it can make another decision, and then it can make another decision. So Natalia, you've written a great deal about narratives, how to shape better ones, the difficulty of changing them once they're entrenched, and so the path dependence that's there. But you've also written really critically in a way that reminded me of some of Justin's work that stories don't and can't act alone, that the stories and the policy choices interact so that, for instance, perceptions of chaos at the border affect public opinion. So policies that create visible of chaos will affect your narrative and your ability to shape the narrative, things like that. So can you give a couple of examples of how stories might constrain policy choices, or how some of the policy choices, maybe some of the ones that map onto these areas that Justin's talked about, can affect narratives positively or negatively?
Sure. And I really appreciate Justin's analysis here, because I think what he's pulling out of this are very universal themes and trends. And we see these existential fears even in places where the demographic wave has not come, where the fear of crime and chaos that people are anxious about, you wouldn't really be able to discern it in statistics, where there hasn't been a complete takeover of people's jobs and livelihoods. But these fears get lodged in, and they're very persistent. And so I think this leads us to a couple different reflections. One, it's all about relative insecurity and relative anxiety. And so regardless of the actual numbers or demographic trends, you see this fear that people all over the world have, that newcomers are going to become dominant in their society, whether in terms of economics, culture and identity, or politics, or change its fundamental character in a way that they weren't consulted on, that they didn't have a say in. And so this sort of fear of being replaced can be very, very powerful. And one of the main ways we try to deal with it kind of reinforces it, right? So we talk about sort of expanding the we. How do you push people toward inclusion and accommodation rather than, exclusion and further constraining people's rights? But in a lot of these societies, people feel like expanding the we is a form of erasure of their own identity. And so this becomes really, really, really complex. And then, of course, there are some concrete things in terms of power sharing arrangements, in certain political systems around the world, where there is proportional representation pinned on different, religious or ethnic groups, Lebanon, for example. And so any change in the demographic makeup of society, is going to have some repercussions for people's political power. But then again, it's also the perception of this loss of power that can happen, even where the trends haven't materialized yet. And so, so what can we do about this? I think, just two things I would point out: that a lot of this is about perceived lack of control. Where there is sort of no end in sight to an influx of new immigrants, no systems in place to manage the flows, people being promised one thing by their governments and, told to expect one thing, and then experiencing something completely different. And so, these perceptions of chaos, lack of control, can tip anxieties into this like powerful existential fear place, even when the conditions that we observe on the ground are really small. So you see this, with unaccompanied minors crossing, the U.S. southern border. things like that, where you have relatively small flows, but something becomes very, very, very visible and very overwhelming, and spikes these feelings of powerlessness in people. And so we can talk a little bit more later why, some of the tools I do think we have to address some of these fears. But I think, we have to understand that it's less about the material conditions on the ground and more about people's feelings of their relative place in society as a result of these changes. So loss of control and, feeling like things are unfair or they're being taken advantage of, etc.
It's so interesting that you said this. I've read this kind of analysis before, but the way you put it just really resonated. I have two children, one of whom's pretty easygoing and lackadaisical. The other's a little higher anxiety and really does like control. She doesn't like transition. She doesn't like change. She wants more control. And if I said to her, "Oh, don't worry about who's coming in and out of our house," she would not react well to that statement. And so I think this idea that anxiety and control really isn't about a sheer number, but is about people who want to feel some sense that there's a policy, there's a way of dealing with it. Justin, most of the time that shows like this or discussions like this talk about narrative, they talk about it from the perspective of the immigrant. How do we show that we're more welcoming? How do we bring more people in a way that's more inclusive and so on? And I want to get to that. But you've written from the white working class perspective. And one of the things that you said really resonated with a point Natalia made, which was that the white working class suddenly felt seen and heard in our recent elections with Trump. And that one of the things that had been happening was that they were viewing these accusations that they were racist, that they were racist against immigrant, as a way of silencing them, as a way of telling them that it ceased to matter, that their views were invalidated. And you were saying, when somebody says, "Now I'm not a racist," but what they're really saying is, don't dismiss me, don't erase me, don't quiet me down. So how does a liberal society that wants to talk about how to be inclusive toward immigration deal with a group that is having this kind of anxiety about their actual demographic place or their perceived demographic place, as Natalia is pointing out, being more important? And what does that mean about our idea of how to be inclusive when one group is feeling silenced that way? How do we address that from a policy perspective and a narrative perspective?
Well, we can do a number of things that are simply not being done right now. Right now, on the sort of immigrant rights world and on the progressive left of most countries, the idea of control when it comes to immigration is anathema. It's basically a four-letter word. And so I think that we have to come to a point to recognize that there is an inherent human desire for some degree of, if not control, at least order, at least management. And that when you communicate that level of control, when you communicate order and management, people actually loosen up and actually are more open to allowing greater immigration flows in. And this is exactly what we saw post-Brexit. So if the frustration with an out of control immigration system in Britain, which was allowing people from all over Europe to come in, and that irked a lot of Britons, if that was the problem, it was resolved with Brexit. And as soon as that illusion of control happened, the Boris Johnson government was actually far more open about immigration than any of the previous governments. They allowed a lot of governments in thereafter, and even in the context of the post-pandemic world. And so, and if you look at British attitudes towards immigration right now, they're far more liberal than what they were beforehand. And so, one thing I think is actually capitulating and actually recognizing that giving a sense of control does not necessarily mean reducing immigration flows. It means what it says it means. It means management and order. And I think that that's actually something that transcends both parties in the United States, except for maybe the furthest reaches of the left. The second thing that parties can do is to actually recognize a lot of the white working class and white suburbanites that have turned towards populist candidates and submitted to this populist and authoritarian wave. To the extent that they felt silenced before, they don't feel that way anymore, but it's only coming from one party. And, the left is broadly very uncomfortable with this group of people. They're not sure how to fit them into their coalitions, and most don't even want to try, but they're still enormously populous. So even while the United States is population-wise, demographic-wise, en route to this majority-minority milestone, we're about 59% white in the United States right now, or people who currently self-identify as white. But actually about 70% of our voters are white today. And that actually could potentially grow as we have a large number of Hispanics in the United States who self-identify as white, and people who are of mixed race backgrounds who self-identify as white. And so the politics of whiteness is not necessarily going anywhere just because our demographics change. And this group is going to need to be the focus to some degree of political parties who want to win. The final thing I think really relates to narratives. And so what the way that control has been conveyed by the far right and by populists and semi-authoritarian movements has been with nostalgia. They're not actually giving control. They're aspiring to control by promising to hit the brakes on progress. And if you listen to the slogans of "Make America Great Again," "Take Back Control," "We Want Our Country Back," from Germany to Britain to the United States, these are slogans of nostalgia. It's about regressing to an earlier, simpler time when people feel like there was more control. Of course, all of this is just a construction of what the past was like, but the point is that the left has to have their own answer to this, and I think that it's about invoking national heritage and nationalism in a way that actually communicates the pivotal nature of immigration to a nation's survival. And this is something that the left has not done by making most of the stories be about immigrants themselves. And so I think there are a number of ways that to actually reach these populations that you're underscoring, but there just hasn't been a whole lot of effort to try.
Thank you, Justin. I want to tell our listeners that we would love to take your questions. So please start sending them in. I could just talk with Justin and Natalia for about 3 hours with no problem, but that would not be fair to all of you. So please start sending questions in and I'll try to integrate them. But Natalia, Justin's remarks just brought up 2 new questions for you. And so I'm going to shoot both of them at you. One was that he talks about how you actually give a sense of order. How can you give a sense of order that still allows for inclusion? And you in your writing talk about invoking some pragmatism, not just compassion, to plan for long-term integration, to give people, again, a sense of where are people going after the influx or swarm or the negative language that's getting used, what happens. So I want you to expand a little bit on what it means to invoke some more pragmatism rather than just compassion. And then I saw you nodding when Justin was talking, and I would love for that emotional reaction to come out as you were nodding at some of his points about this management of expectation and of narrative both.
Yes, you're right. That really resonated with me because for a long time, I've felt like we need to get away from trying to change people's minds. So I think the political left gets caught in this trap with immigration where we have a set of positive narratives that we would like everybody to embrace. And we're working so hard on this supply side. What's the perfect narrative? How do I, create this story that can be embraced, and sort of trying to foist it on people and not meeting people where they are. And I think we just have to accept that there is a level of anxiety that comes with large scale change, that comes with accepting newcomers into your society. That is reasonable. There is a level that is reasonable. And so we tend to focus on the unreasonable manifestations of this anxiety, right? The actual xenophobia, the discrimination, the prejudice, invocations of this glorious past that, neo-fascist nationalists, the radical right, tend to rely on, that Justin was alluding to. which of course paints this picture of, a perfect homogenous, ethnically homogenous society that we should all go back to. That's problematic. But I think, by focusing up here, we are painting everybody that feels uneasy about their place in the world with the same brush. And this is what the right has capitalized on, because they've seen that people have these anxieties and they're giving them a place to air them. And I think you could argue that some of the most dramatic increases in support for right-wing and radical right parties in Europe, Sweden comes to mind, have been in some ways a reaction to people feeling like, as long as they were within the mainstream parties, they didn't have a platform through which they could express these views without being painted as racist and xenophobic and unreasonable. So I really think that the first thing we have to do is meet people where they are, try to understand why they have some of these anxieties. Because again, some of the things that manifest in an ugly way, in a xenophobic way, actually are about concrete things when you kind of dig down. And so I think we have to see what is at the root that is giving rise to these different expressions of anger and scapegoating and anxiety about immigrants themselves, because it might not actually have to do with immigrants, right? It's more about these other changes that are happening in society. And then I think the other part that resonates with me, I mean, you were talking about how I've written about pragmatism versus compassion. I think we also get stuck in a very narrow set of moral frames through which we view these issues. And so, the sort of cosmopolitan elite has their own sort of moral frames and values that they rely on, and that they're trying to impose on other people. And I think we have to accept that there is no monopoly on morality. We might think that being compassionate, being open, being worldly are the most important kind of values, but there are other people, in sort of more conservative boxes that place more weight on hierarchy, on authority, on loyalty, family. And, we're not going to get anywhere if we say my values are more important and better than your values. I think we have to accept that people sometimes express certain preferences about managing immigration that seem very restrictive, that can even seem, hostile and discriminatory, that actually do come from a place of morality. And I think until we sort of, try to bridge those two positions, we're not going to get anywhere.
And we're so quick, I think, to label people racists when, yes, there very well may be some racial resentment. There's likely a lot of discomfort, anxiety with demographic change out there. But the label is acting as a way of disqualifying people. In many ways, when I was using the words invalidate, Rachel, in my earlier work, I was sort of really a predecessor to cancel culture, which didn't exist when I published my book, The New Minority, in 2016. But that emerged in the years thereafter. The invalidation of someone is infuriating, obviously, to those folks, especially when they feel like they have a legitimate view. And that's basically the tension that we see right now. People feel out of bounds. Again, recognizing that there often is some kind of racial resentment, some kind of discomfort at the core of their views, but they feel unconsulted and out of control. And, but these are precisely the folks who are in an alliance against demographic change and against future immigration flows. One of the things I think we've done, Natalia and Rachel, up until now is the immigrant sort of lobby, the coalitions that are pro-immigration and pro-immigrant have been so focused about improving the image of immigrants, right? Selling immigrants as these wonderful people who contribute to society, which, by the way, they are wonderful. They contribute enormously. They're entrepreneurs, they're innovators. They fill critical labor gaps, both at high skill and low skill levels. They're humanitarian cases. They are sometimes vulnerable. They need our help. We have an obligation to them. We're a nation of immigrants. All these things are true. And they have taken us a long way in the United States towards persuading people, towards embracing immigration and immigrants. But it's not working enough. It's not actually extending to the skeptics that we're talking about. And so there needs to be something different to try. And I think that meeting people where they are, that line, that's literally a subheading, a chapter heading in my book, actually, Natalia. Meeting people where they are is the way to go here. Lecturing them, intervening, trying to persuade them to change who they are and what they do to actually see the change we want to see is not going to work. And then there's also this inclination as well, I think, of creating something new about who we are. I mentioned who are we several times in some of my earlier remarks about the question, this existential question facing our countries across the transatlantic space right now. But actually, most people don't want anything new. Most people don't want a new version of the national identity. What we have to do is to create something. We have to invent something old. We need to invent something that is already there, already present, that rings true with people's understanding of who we are as a nation in order to justify our continuing evolution. And that is really, I think, the trillion-dollar question, the quintessential social challenge of our times facing us.
It's interesting. I've just been reading a book about the different people who created stories of America, and that there are these very competitive stories of America. Woodrow Wilson, who a lot of left-wing folks look up to as a great progressive, but was also an incredible racist and wrote one of the big books about America that lasted for a long time with a very racialized Southern view. He was Southern, not to everyone in the South, but this very racialized post-Civil War view of America versus this kind of Northern Yankee view of America on a Puritan mission versus a Frederick Douglass and his view of American history. So we've always had these competitive histories. Many countries have these competitive histories. And one of the things I found interesting about your earlier remarks, Justin, was that you said that the communities that work with immigration focus on this individual immigrant and how to shape the image of that immigrant, whereas you're thinking, how do you shape the image of the nation to pull back into this history and pull on that? When I ran the Truman National Security Project, we talked a lot about connect then lead, because all the messaging research showed that you have to connect, you have to make people feel that you share some values in common. And I remember when we talked about immigration, because that was a huge issue when I was still running Truman, it was the one issue that our community found extraordinarily hard to connect, because they felt that connecting meant they had to be racist. And I would try to talk with them, and our communications leaders would try to talk to them about the elements of this story that you're bringing out. I mean, when the Syrian influx of immigrants went to Lebanon, and suddenly you had schools that were really overcrowded in Lebanon with people who spoke similar language and looked quite similar and so on. The school overcrowding was a concrete issue that was real. And we could think about it in that context. But trying to import that back and take away the racial language in America is very, very hard. One thing that we also did at Truman that I want to ask you both about was that we worked with military veterans as messengers. We were working on national security issues. It made sense to talk with military veterans. But it was because the message was important, but the messenger was really, really important in order to connect with people. Justin, I know you've done work. I'd love for you to share the story of Richard Wagner and your work there. And Natalia, I'd also love for you to talk a little bit about this issue of messenger and how you shape a narrative with who's the one talking. So Justin, I'll go to you first because I've clued you into Richard.
No worries. Yeah. So his name was John Wagner, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is the gentleman. Don't worry. He's made up, so who knows what his name is. So let me share with our viewers the story behind this. So throughout my research on these different majority-minority societies, I was struck by the power of not only messages, the sort of construction of national identities, but also the messengers who are delivering them. And so my co-author, Tyler Rennie, on a paper that was incorporated into the book, Tyler and I wanted to test the effect of a Republican white male messenger basically leveraging his co-identification with other white Republicans to persuade that actually, immigration, we can liberalize our immigration policies. And what we did is we actually identified who are the most liked and trusted Republican messengers out there, because psychological research suggests that when you find someone who is liked and trusted, they can persuade you to change your mind about things that you otherwise had pretty rigid views on. but it's never really been tested on immigration and matters of race and ethnicity, because psychologists have also found that those are some of the hardest views to change, the hardest public attitudes to move. So we wanted to give it a try this way. So we actually hired voice actors to impersonate a variety of Republican luminaries, including, in particular, the most liked and trusted person at that time, who was Sean Hannity. And we also want to see, what the effect would be if Sean Hannity took a more liberal view. Some of you might be thinking, well, that's unrealistic. Sean Hannity's, very anti-immigration, and he's unlikely to help you. Well, one of those things are true. He's unlikely to help anyone on this side, but he has actually changed his mind on immigration a couple of times in his career. That aside, we were sensitive to the fact that maybe he wouldn't help. So even if he was effective at changing minds, we wanted to also propose someone anonymous. So we created this image of the chairman of the Republican Party, who we deceived people into thinking was a gentleman named John Wagner. And a voice actor using Mike Pence's voice actually impersonated John Wagner and gave a spirited defense of liberalizing immigration laws slightly, ever so slightly, while also priming people on their co-identity, their fellow Republican views from a white male politician, a white male elite. And Wagner was, of course, fake, so he didn't exist. The chairman of the Republican Party was actually a chairwoman, Ronna Romney McDaniel. And Wagner, of course, is not actually a person. So we wanted to see if just any old elite would do, any old Republican would do. And the short of it is that he was effective. We were able to move Republican attitudes marginally, but also statistically significantly, with just a 30-second intervention coming from this guy, John Wagner, who no one had ever heard of before because he doesn't exist. So what this shows is that meeting people where they are is not just about inventing messages and narratives that resonate with them with where they are right now, but also engaging with and not rejecting the people that they trust. So much about American politics right now is about this like purity tests, right? It's like if we don't agree on one or two or even three issues, we can't be friends. But actually, there are allies across the aisle who are really critical to persuasion if they can actually give the legitimacy of the credibility that they hold and lend it to an issue as critical as immigration and demographic change.
I want to move us out of the US-centric realm a little bit here, because there's a whole world dealing with immigration right now. And Natalia, you advise governments through the Transatlantic Council on Migration, and you're trying to give them policy advice, probably somewhat similar to what you're telling us here. What is the hardest that you're trying to tell governments to do that you're finding is the hardest for them to take up, and why?
Well, it's hard to generalize because we have to. There are a lot of political constraints that sort of combine with the technical problems that we're also discussing. But I think one thing that we talk about that dovetails with what Justin said is this issue of not just focusing on the supply side of the messages that we want out in the world, but focusing also on the messenger. The experiment that Justin described makes complete sense to me, because I think often we don't think about the psychology of how people absorb information and why they're so motivated to embrace certain things and discredit other things. And so, there are all sorts of, there's all sorts of research behind this. We're very motivated to dismiss things that don't cohere with what we already believe. And we're very motivated to dismiss things that don't sort of reinforce our identities, because we get something out of these identities that we've forged for ourselves. And so we want things that are going to reinforce this for us. And so I think one mistake that governments make is assuming that people care about accuracy and care about facts and information more than they care about values and belonging. And, you know, I think we just have to accept that once information becomes sort of absorbed into people's identity. So if you have a social reason to believe something, it gives you kind of membership into this group. People are going to cling to it because it serves this vital social purpose. And so, saying that you're concerned about crime or concerned about disorder can be related to things like protecting your family and loyalty. And so you can't just sort of shake people out of this, out of a belief that really has some social utility for them, based on churning out information alone. And so having a messenger from within people's circle of identity that basically gives them permission to change their views is exactly what you need to kind of break the hold that people will have around that information. So no amount of sort of facts, data, et cetera, is going to be able to pierce an information or a belief system that, again, has some social utility for people. So I think that's we keep getting caught in this trap of, if we just provide the right information, then people will believe it, and that's not true.
I want to get away from narrative just for a minute and move back into the realm of policy, because Justin, in 2018, you write this book with Anna Boucher, where you consider a variety of immigration regimes across 30 countries around the world. And I'd love for you to share some of the findings about what models countries are converging on, and what happens if the most popular countries are adopting the most popular similar model. Does that work, given that migration is a global phenomenon, even if it has regional components?
Sure, it's a great question because it's so plugged into our populist politics these days, and the politics of nationalism too. Around the 1990s, there was this sense that post-Cold War, the world was opening, borders were opening, walls were falling down, and it was a new era. And there was this sense among a lot of scholars of immigration in the European space and also in the North American space that we would see the liberalization of immigration more broadly, and that countries were going to converge towards a sort of North American model of immigration policy, more open, greater access to citizenship, greater access to permanent flows, which often come from either refugee migration or family migration or highly skilled permanent labor migration. But what my book with Anna Crossroads did in 2018 is we took a look at the demographic statistics of who is being admitted and who is getting citizenship across 30 of the world's most prominent immigration destinations to understand, well, where are things today? And the general finding is that we really have shifted a long way away from the liberal model. Where we are right now is something that we classify, or we call, a market model. And the market model has three fundamental elements to it that we are seeing spreading across the globe, really, in the global south, as well as East Asian countries and parts of Europe and North America too. And the three fundamental elements are, first, a very strong emphasis on labor migration. Countries are shifting toward labor modes of entry and focusing on certain skill shortages at the low skilled level, but also at the high skilled level. Second, they are focusing on temporary labor migration. There's an enormous emphasis on the temporary nature of visa classes. So states, in response to demographic aging and labor needs and the desire to bring in people of different skill sets, also are balancing the nationalism and the populism and the xenophobia that we've been observing. And their response is, okay, we're going to let people in the country still, but don't worry, they don't have access to permanent status. They're not going to stay long. The third component which flows from this is a drop in naturalization. So citizenship rates have also dropped over the last 20 years. And what we're witnessing is basically a downstream effect of more temporary visas that don't have outlets to citizenship. And so in many ways, you can think of this as the sort of Uberization of immigration policy. We want people to do their job. We want to be able to discard them after they're done, and we don't want to give them permanent status so that they can access benefits or subsidies. That is basically what's happening now to immigration. So you have the gig economy on the one hand, and now you kind of have gig immigration policies too. And they're really highly connected to the political moment that we're in right now, because this market model is not just something that's limited to the kafala regimes, the sponsorship regimes of the Middle East in the Arabian Peninsula, which have used this model basically from the inception of their immigration programs. We're now seeing it take root in places like Japan and Korea, and we're seeing similar changes made elsewhere in Europe and Canada and Australia, which are also leaning heavily on temporary labor migration too, despite actually quite high naturalization rates. So this is really where the global trend is moving right now. It doesn't mean it's always going to be this way, but the market model rules.
Natalia, when you're talking to governments about these different immigration regimes and what they can do, are you experiencing this trend that Justin's talking about, that governments are thinking, well, one way we can offer our citizens order is by saying that these people aren't going to be here for very long, or they're going to be temporary, or what have you? Are you seeing openness to other kind of regimes? Because it strikes me that if most of the major destination countries start having this kind of regime that I associate very much with Gulf states, then you'll have a kind of class of people moving around from country to country, maybe highly skilled, but who stay for a couple of years here and a couple of years there, and then they have to move on. And this doesn't seem like the healthiest pattern for a globe.
Yeah, I mean, I think across the board, you see that when governments are under pressure, there is this erosion of the rights associated with each migration channel. So whether we're talking about labor migration, whether we're talking about humanitarian migration, I think if we look at what's happening all around the world with restrictions on asylum, with resettlement numbers being slashed, with new temporary forms of protection taking the place of more established traditional refugee regimes, we have to think about, what's the sum total of all of these small efforts to sort of chip away around the edges of what used to be kind of the standard package available to people. And I think sometimes these political compromises look pretty tantalizing. If it's the only thing you can get through, isn't it better to have people here, in whatever fashion, if they're escaping hardship or persecution, or really cannot find livelihoods in their countries of origin? Isn't it better than nothing? And I think that's an open question. I think, we have to, there are the immediate downsides to this, which one, even people who come in temporarily don't always go home, right? And so you relying on this temporary regime without admitting that people might become part of the fabric of communities for generations sets you up for, again, this disconnect between what people feel they were promised by their government and what has actually transpired, which can cause more panic, more anxiety than if you had just told people, well, we're bringing in 100,000 permanent migrants, and this is why, and this is our plan. And then I think the other downside of this this grand bargain is that you're also, by not giving people a path to permanency and a path to citizenship, ideally, you're also saying, you're also sort of letting people off the hook in terms of the investments that they make into society. I mean, if you're only going to be here for 2 years, what can we reasonably really ask of people, in terms of going through all the integration steps that we normally think are important? And so I think it's a real double-edged sword, because it's very important for host communities to feel that there's a two-way responsibility, that people are investing in them as much as we're investing in newcomers. And so if you sort of say, actually, this isn't a permanent arrangement, and so we don't need to invest in each other, you're not going to see good integration outcomes. There are going to be some repercussions for social cohesion as well. So I think, we have seen this gradual chipping away at the rights associated with all forms of immigration, and it's going to have some serious consequences down the line.
I'm really glad, Natalia, that you brought up sort of both sides of that equation. I'm an expat this year, and I was just thinking, as you were talking about the first side of the equation, well, what about the other side? Because I noticed myself, I'm not going to invest in my school community the way I do back home, because I'm just here for a year. Am I really going to join the Parent-Teacher Association? How much am I going to learn this language versus survival form of this language? Because I'm only here for a year. Am I going to plant flowers outside? It's like creating a whole community of renters versus homeowners, and expecting to have a cohesive, which we don't do with the homeownership versus renter equation. And so I think societies that are doing this kind of extreme temporary situation aren't really thinking about the full downstream effects of that, especially because you say some of these people do end up staying for very long periods of time. It's kind of an endless series of one-year promises and not planting the flowers in your yard. And then suddenly it's been 15 years of re-upping. I want to give you each a chance to have one last word, because we have to close in just a minute. So I'd like to give each of you sort of the last thing you want to say. If you can leave people with one point that you're trying to make, what would it be, Justin?
Ooh, gosh, there's so many. There's so many things to be thinking about. I think that if I was going to sum things up, it really would be about meeting people where they are. I would hone in on this idea, and I think that for societies that are coping with demographic change, I think it takes courage to actually be honest with societies, to be transparent about the changes that are transpiring. But human beings, people respond to transparency. They respond to being consulted, and they respond to the sense of control that gives them, the sense of efficacy that it gives them. And certainly, I think that more than anything, I hear that I'm an optimist in this space where there's so much pessimism. And I think that, when people say that about me, it's almost like an affront, right? It's like I'm being insulted. Shame on you for being so, Pollyanna-ish in your views. But to the extent that I'm an optimist about these things, Rachel and Natalia, it's because I don't actually think we've tried very hard. If you think about where climate change was about 40, 30 years ago, this was something that was coming down the pike on the horizon, several decades later. And there are a lot of people who we then castigated as tree huggers telling us, you need to pay attention to this. I feel like today's tree hugger. I believe that we need to be creating institutions, strategy, policy to address demographic change. It's not this chaotic, wild thing that we can't control. It takes courage. It takes strategy. It takes investment, just in the way that we've developed maybe an inadequate climate infrastructure, but at least something towards sustainability today. And I think that, we need to create the subcommittee on demographic change, in our respective parliaments. We need to have advisors on social cohesion and national solidarity for chief executives, not only of governments, but of companies and civil society. This has to be a focus area, much in the way that all companies and civil society groups and governments now ask, do you have to print this piece of paper? Sustainability has become this universal norm and criterion that we overlay on our activities. I think that national solidarity and social cohesion has to be too. Otherwise, we're doomed to this division.
Natalia, you get the final word.
I don't know if I'm as optimistic as Justin, but I will add on to that I agree that I think it's really important to acknowledge people's fears and sense of discomfort in terms of their place in the world, and not try to gloss over that. I think we have to admit that there are costs to immigration. We can all talk about the benefits across every sort of part of society and across all sorts of different metrics. But we have to also acknowledge that there are costs, and these costs accrue unevenly. And so when you're talking to people, it doesn't matter that we have this sort of bird's eye picture of how a whole national economy is going to look, that we have the sort of grand plan. People interpret things on a very individual level. What is happening to me? What is happening to my neighbor? What is the trajectory for my children? And so, acknowledging that there are some costs, and therefore not trying to prove to people that this openness that we're advocating for is only going to have benefits, but showing them what benefits it can have. So I think we need to show people that immigration is in their own self-interest. We're not trying to persuade them to agree to it because it's the nice thing to do, because it's a good thing to do, but actually showing people why it is in their self-interest, in the interest of their families and their communities.
I love that. Actually, I'm going to take the last word just to point out that when Canada made its switch from a kind of white Canada policy back in the 60s of immigration to a more multicultural Canada, one of the things they started doing, I think in the 80s or 90s, was running these ads about immigrants who were doctors, immigrants who were firefighters. And remind you that, hey, you want to go to a doctor? It sure helps that we have a lot of doctors. It sure helps that we have a lot of nurses and so on, just to draw out what are the selfish benefits that this accrues to you and your society. Well, we couldn't have had a better set of guests. Thank you so much. I know you all can't join me in thanking Justin and Natalia, but I will thank them on behalf of all of us. That was a really rich discussion, and frankly, a lot richer than many of the discussions on immigration that are happening in the public sphere. And I hope many more governments and organizations are listening to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.